First am I, Judith Lay here, once again opening the door to the archive room, Manx Radio's treasure chest of stories of island life from years gone by, told by the people who were there. So come on in, and let me take you for another gentle stroll down Manx memory lane. And here's a clue to where I'm standing now.
Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas.
From Manx Radio.
Yes, a vintage station jingle is just the start of so much great material stacked up on the shelf labelled Christmas. So let's see what we can find. Now here's something that doesn't actually mention Christmas at all, but it's on the shelf because it was first broadcast on Christmas Eve in 1996. Roy Macmillan worked for around 11 years here at Manx Radio, and during that time produced and presented a raft of programmes on a wide range of topics, and managed to do something that no one else could. He interviewed Geraldine Jamieson. Geraldine had a long career with Manx Radio, but always it was she who was asking the questions. The Geraldine Jamieson interview on a Sunday morning was a firm fixture in our schedule. But Geraldine would never agree to be interviewed herself. But somehow Roy persuaded her to talk to him for a Christmas special. It's funny, fascinating, and almost 30 years since it was first broadcast.
Today, I'm in the privileged position to be interviewing one of Manx Radio's premier interviewers, Geraldine Jamieson. Now, the reason it's a particular privilege is because you're not someone who gives many interviews, Geraldine.
No, I don't. I've always avoided it, really like the plague in the past, Roy. I sort of thought, really, that perhaps it might be better, to keep the mystery of the private Geraldine.
Is that really the reason you've avoided it, or are you actually rather shy, perhaps, and a bit loath to reveal yourself?
Someone once described me as being an introvert, really, with extrovert tendencies. I adore broadcasting. I've done it for many, many a moon. And I do think that broadcasters are actually born, not made. You may be able to hone and polish, but there has to be that innate spark there. But then, at the end of your job, you go home, and I like to sort of pull up the drawbridge and live the private side of Geraldine. And that I do keep, actually, quite a low profile, really.
You say you've been in broadcasting many years. How did it all begin?
Well, it all began really because I flew for Irish International Airlines, Aer Lingus. Being an air hostess for 5 years, I lived in Dublin, born in Belfast, but lived in Dublin then. And those, I often think, were the best years of my life. They were terrifically educational, quite apart from visiting, travelling all over the world. But we had a great camaraderie. It was a wonderful spirit in Dublin then amongst the girls. In fact, I was the first girl Aer Lingus ever employed from the north of Ireland, and the others were very welcome. But there was wonderful music and theatre. We weren't over-endowed with the financial resources of this life, but we always managed. We would be in the Gods of the Abbey Theatre about 3 or 4 times a week if we were all in town together and that sort of thing. It was a really marvellous time of my life. But when I married then, my husband was ex-RAF and we met actually at an airline party. And however, being an air hostess doesn't really equip you actually for married life. And after the first 6 weeks of married bliss, Stuart said to me, what do you do? What can you do in the way of contributing to the household exchequer? Well then, in those days, just quite a few moons ago, I must admit, girls really, they either worked in a bank or they taught or they did nursing. That was probably the extent of careers open to women. So I didn't do any of those things. But on one of the flights, it actually was a pilgrimage to Lourdes, and I was the sort of senior hostess on this flight to Lourdes. And I remember a gentleman saying to me, who was accompanying the flight, he said, "Oh, you have a great broadcasting voice. I had just done the PA Tannoy announcement." And I remember going back to the galley to the other girls and saying, "This is a very unusual chat-up line." And I discovered then, actually, that he was quite serious. He was a producer in RTE, which is Radio Telefís Éireann. And that just sort of lodged in the back of my head. So when husband said, "What can you do to help with the finances of the family?" I thought to myself, well, perhaps broadcasting. And with the complete arrogance and confidence of youth, with all the years of experience behind me now, I would not do the same thing again. I wrote to the BBC in Northern Ireland. They hadn't advertised. They didn't require anybody that I knew of, and told them why they should employ me. And I went along. About 6 weeks later, they actually called one for an audition. And I'm very sad to learn, actually, that just 2 months ago, this gentleman, well known here on the Isle of Man, actually helped me. They roped him in to sort of your role at the moment, Roy, you know, to be the interviewer. I didn't even have the first basics of interviewing. And he saved me. And he was Dr. Havelock Nelson, who unfortunately, as I say, just died 2 months ago, and was very well known here, marvellous musical composer, conductor, and so forth, on the Isle of Man. And after that, sort of things never looked back.
So what was your first job then?
Well, it was really contributing small interviews for their regional update. It was television, their regional update, which was called Scene, SCENE, around 6. And then in the end, I presented Scene Around 6. Well, there were other presenters, but I was one of the main presenters of Scene Around 6 on Northern Ireland BBC television. And Gloria Hannaford, we're very much of the same vintage, was working for Ulster Television. She had her own show on Ulster Television virtually at the same time. We often used to share a prawn and egg sandwich together.
Glamorous time.
Either in Belfast or London, and even still to this day exchange Christmas cards. So that really was the beginning of it. And one just rolled on then, as they say.
Now, I've noticed during the course of this conversation that you've used the word one to describe yourself. And I just wonder whether this is a distancing mechanism, whether you're trying to keep yourself distant from what you're saying, or whether it's simply a habit picked up.
My father was Irish, although had a neutral accent. Certainly didn't have an Irish accent. He was a lawyer, barrister from Trinity College, Dublin. And he used to read the book at bedtime, actually, for BBC, because he had this neutral accent. My mother was English. She married very young at 18. Her parents came to Ireland, and her father was an army, was a major in the army, and they came over on a course of duty or something, and she met my father, and she married at 18, but she never lost her English accent, and she used one a lot. But also, you're quite right, I'm quite shy, so I do hide, actually, behind the day job. But probably that is why that I'm taking it away from me, you know, in the first person.
You've said before in this conversation that you're not particularly patriotic, but I'd like to know a little bit about your upbringing. Where were you born?
I was born in Belfast, but we went to live in the country. I had a severe childhood, you could put it that way, because my father was 45 when I was born. My mother was younger. They'd longed for a child. They were afraid that I was sort of growing up really amongst elderly people, you know, of their age group. I didn't talk much, apparently. And they thought the best thing to do would be to send one to boarding school. So at 7 years of age, they sent one to boarding school. My father didn't want one to have an Irish accent, so he wanted to send one to England to boarding school. My English mother, of course, it was, you know, in hysterics and so on, her one chicken child being taken away from her, and certainly didn't want it across the water. So they compromised, and I went to an Irish boarding school, but it was run by a Scottish headmistress, a Scottish matron, and it was grim. It really was grim. I ran away from it 3 times. It was quite unhappy, I must say. I mean, there were tears, forever tears, going back to the school. But on the other hand, looking back on it, it did give one a sense of independence and possibly that confidence. And it certainly was a very good school academically, etc. There were pluses, I just didn't appreciate them at the time.
There are more than enough people who've started one way or another in broadcasting and for one reason or another haven't gone any further. So there you were, without much experience, doing these little interviews. How did it grow from there? And what happened to you? Where did you go?
A very kind, elderly producer. It was a vast, vast setup, the BBC Northern Ireland. It was even larger than Manchester, actually, in their regional staff and building and output. You could see I was really harassed one day. And he said, look, Geraldine, he said, at the end of the day, just be yourself. And I think really it is the best advice. I never went to university. I opted for travelling the world, really, with this airline. But I often think I've had a university of the airwaves since, meeting so many different people from various walks of life. However, I did have a lucky break in that I co-presented the Late Late Show with Gay Byrne. Well, I co-presented that.
And you can't just say, I co-presented the Late Late Show. How did that come about?
Well, he always used to have, I don't know what he does nowadays, but he always used to have sort of two backup presenters with him on this show. And because he virtually ran it. I mean, he was the producer and director of it. And it was live, of course. And Ulick O'Connor and myself co-presented with him for 6 weeks. He actually took one on for one show. And then as a result of that, I did 6 weeks. Well, some interesting people came on, and I learned quite a bit, really, from that. And that sort of cemented me. And that sort of secured, in a way, one's career then in Northern Ireland.
So what did you go on to do immediately after that?
Unfortunately, my husband succeeded in business. I shouldn't say that. But it meant that we had to consider actually making a move away from Northern Ireland. It also, the Troubles were at the height, and he had his own security firm. So for obvious reasons, between one thing and another, he thought we should perhaps leave Ireland for 3 years. He did promise that we would go back at the end of 3 years. And that brought us to the Isle of Man, which was the nearest doorstep, really, to Ireland, of course. And I thought I would be going back in 3 years. But after 6 weeks here, I never wanted to go back.
What was it about the island that made you feel so at home?
I think it was the first Christmas. We literally arrived 6 weeks before Christmas. We had a charming little Manx cottage on Fisher's Hill. It was lovely. And we lived in it for 5 years. And however, the carpets hadn't come. There was some hold-up and so on. But it didn't matter because people in the local shops in Castletown really took this problem of me not having any carpets, right under their belt. And they were most concerned. And we had 6 Manx Christmas cards after only 6 weeks here. And I really thought how welcoming the people were. And of course, Northern Ireland was going through the height of the modern troubles. And people were a lot more guarded and so on. And here was a free expression, if you like, of welcome, warmth, and just getting on with day-to-day living. And it was a real joy.
Now, you arrived, you'd been quite successful in Ireland, but did you have a foothold in Manx Radio at that point? Did you announce you were coming over?
Not at all, no. In fact, I did nothing for a year. I felt I just needed to find my way around the island, literally, and get the home sorted out, etc. And my husband was really concerned that I wouldn't settle because sometimes, businessmen and so on, they've got somewhere to go to, obviously their business, and the wives get unsettled and homesick and all the rest. So he thought perhaps he should buy me a shoe shop or a fashion shop or something which would keep me occupied. And I kept turning down all these amazing ideas. And then after a year, I thought to myself, well, the one thing that I really perhaps could do and liked doing was broadcasting. But I wasn't just too sure about it over here because here, of course, it was radio, not national television for the island. However, we bumped into Mark White, who happened to live in the south of the island, not far from us, and become very good friends. And he arranged for one to have an audition here. And I came along. Guess who was presenting the Late Show and sort of auditioned one live, on the Late Show? Roger Watterson. And then as a result of that, they used to have a magazine program called Roundabout in the afternoon. And I used to come in with small interviews for them, that sort of thing. Nothing very much. Then one day, Charles Gard said to me, perhaps you'd like to do a half-hour series of an interview one-to-one with someone. You could do it, say, as a pilot situation for 6 weeks. So I did. That was called at that time, Geraldine is in conversation with whoever, Also, you must never forget that your program is only as good as your interviewee. So if you can choose your interviewees carefully, that's half the secret as well. However, this was only going to be for 6 weeks. I think it was during the summer or something. And I've been doing it now for 15 years. 52 different guests, very few repeats, 52 different guests every year for 15 years. I started up in the year after Millennium Year, so that was 1980. Well, you may say 16 years now, we're nearly at the end of 96.
The question that I should imagine most people ask of any interviewer such as yourself is, how do you find your guests? Now, 16 years, 52 weeks a year, that's a lot of people to find. Do you have tremendous contacts or do you just phone the right agents?
Well, I didn't. But you do need luck in life, Roy, and I think, touch wood here, I am a lucky person. That helps tremendously. It's very, very hard to build up contacts, and it's only contacts who could provide so many guests, as you say. And one person opened the door for me, and this particular door is still opening. It just never seems to close, and a supply of people come through as a result. It was amazing. And this gentleman was Vince Hill. Now, he and his wife and child had come across to do a week's show. I can't remember if it was the Villa Marina or the Gaiety summer show. This would have been the very early 80s. And I went along and interviewed Vince in his hotel bedroom in the Palace Hotel, as it was. And the little boy, Athol, their only child, was across the road on the sand, playing in the sea. And I met his wife, Annie, and she was trying to school him because he was out of school, but they'd taken him with them and so forth. And they were a bit fed up, I think, with constant hotel food. And I just offered them some home hospitality, brought them home to our little Manx cottage on Fisher's Hill, and gave them, supper and so on. And it was just nice, it was a breakaway from the hotel. As a result, Vince and Annie Hill had a very good friend in Blackpool, Jimmy Porter, is the name. Anyone in the show business circles will know the name of Jimmy Porter. And he had an even grander establishment called Ashley Hall on the Fylde coast, just outside Blackpool, and owned umpteen hotels and guest houses in Blackpool, and knew all the showbiz stars there and so on. And he had 2 cottages in the grounds, which he used to rent to these stars for these huge summer seasons in Blackpool. And Annie Hill said to me, I must introduce you to Jimmy Porter. He's the one that would help you with your show. And she did. And as a result, sometimes Charlie Webster would go over, Paul Moulton, whoever was producing at the time, we would go over. And we, of course, were guests in the house, in the hall. And these stars were in the cottage. And Jimmy used to do a great thing. He didn't ask them directly if I could record them and that sort of thing. They would come back, about midnight, 11 to midnight, quite late on. And in this wonderful dining room, he'd have the staff and so on do a fantastic dinner. We'd be eating till about 3 a.m. So if we couldn't engage them, over that dinner, it was up to us then to win the battle, with them. And by 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock next morning, we had a program. And those doors, see, because one led to another. And as long as the program stood up, in quality, then one could say, if I ring up, it's all about luck in life and those precious, precious contacts that you develop.
Now, comparisons, as we all know, are odious things, but they're also great fun. So can we have best and worst interviewees, or do you not feel that you can say such things?
No, I would never, ever, I made a golden rule never to say that about interviews that didn't work out. I like to put it that way. So,
Spirit of goodwill, then, we won't mention the bad ones. What about particularly good interviews?
there is one gentleman who stands out a mile, mostly because he was such a wonderful orator. Colonel Jim Irwin, American astronaut, and he was the first man ever to drive a mechanized vehicle on the surface of the moon, the little buggy Rover 1. And he came to the island through a business contact of my husband's, and he stayed with us. And in fact, we became friendly with his family as well. He planted a tree, actually, in the garden in which we live now. And people can walk through that garden, and there is a little brass plaque. We just put a little brass plaque. It's only a small tree, but a little brass plaque underneath, and it said Colonel Jim Irwin, astronaut. He walked in this garden and on the moon. But he was one of the humblest men I think I've ever come across, and he was a marvellous orator. I have a story. Would you like me to tell a story?
Please do.
About his visit here. I call it my moon rock story. Well, a lot of people actually listening may very well remember his 2 visits to the Isle of Man. One, the first, was in Millennium Year, and he made a superb guest on my program that year, I must say. Now, he and his wife, Mary, were staying with us, and they were asked out, of course, to banks and churches, because he one thing about Jim was, he had a deep faith, which was enhanced after his flight to the moon. But unless you brought up the subject of religion, he certainly didn't ram it down your throat. However, everyone, of course, wanted to hear him speak and see him and so forth. And we had a safe in our little cottage because he'd brought over a piece of moon rock. And I used to think it looked rather drab. It just reminded me of dull grey granite, actually. But this was a piece of, it was priceless, piece of rock from the moon. My husband had been out with him at a business bank dinner or something that night, and it came back, and everybody was very tired. And I think it was the air rally day the next day, and we were all going up to Derby. And Jim was really going to be on show, and Jim went to bed, and my husband said, lock up the piece of moon rock in the safe. Well, I couldn't manage to get the safe open in this thick Manx cottage stone wall. I couldn't get it. I thought, oh, hell with this. So the safest place is I just take it to bed with me and put it under the pillow. Mind you, it was a bit uncomfortable. And I was so tired myself, I just literally dropped out of my clothes, Anyway, I forgot about the moon rock and everything the next morning. I had to get up and make breakfast. Now, Jim had become a vegetarian, and you sort of had to cook this brown rice, simmer it all night long and so on for his breakfast. It was a little difficult, and all that was going on. And police outriders on motorbikes arrived to escort us and this moon rock and everything up to Derby. And of course, my husband went to the safe, and there was no moon rock in the safe. And he said, what did you do with the moon rock? I actually couldn't remember where the moon rock was. So all these people were waiting now. There was a big cavalcade outside. Everybody was held up. The police came in and searched the cottage, and one of them found it. It must have rolled out from under my pillow and got entangled in one sort of, innermost underwear. I had a very red face that day, but Jim always liked to pull my leg with it,
Not the kind of notoriety you want. Now, Geraldine, one or two of your more famous meetings have been across the water. Tell us about your American experiences.
Well, Manx Radio, in their wisdom, in 1990, decided to send me to the White House in Washington to interview our most famous Manx American, of course, Vice President Dan Quayle. This was the 20th of November, 1990, and that, of course, is when the Gulf War was on, and it was also Thanksgiving time in the United States of America. And so President Bush was celebrating Thanksgiving with his troops out in the Gulf. And that left our man Dan in charge of the White House, literally. He was a busy man on that day that I called in the White House. Accompanying me, Robert Quayle. They used to joke, apparently, between themselves that they were sort of distant cousins. They weren't really, but, it was the name, obviously, who was director of Manx Radio. And my husband said he would come along if he could just carry the baggage, even, for support. So, anyway, we got to the White House. This was this was where I was impressed, and overwhelmed. And I didn't have anyone from Manx Radio from the technical side to help me. IRN had been lined up in Washington, but I'd only arrived at midnight the night before and had to be at the White House at 10 o'clock the next morning. So I didn't get to bed until 3 a.m., sort of going over the routine and everything with the IRN people and so forth. It was quite a day. Now, when we got there, we were taken on tours all around the White House where other people actually don't go, beyond the norm. In fact, I've been in the kitchen, I've been in bedrooms because President Bush was away. My husband illegally sat behind the Oval Office, and all these sort of things, but nobody seemed to mind until Dan Quayle, who was really busy, could actually come out and speak to us. So anyway, he came out about 12 o'clock, just slipped into this marvellous entertainment room, a very elegant room. And by this time, there were now executive aides, there were in-house press photographers. It was, as I say, quite disturbing, really. And he's very photogenic, not so dynamic, actually, to look at. I know he has visited the island with his father when he was a senator, so some people will remember him. And I didn't think close up, that he was just so striking, but certainly very good, takes wonderful camera shots and photographs and so forth. And he obviously was. There had been criticism against him already then, and he obviously was on the defensive and a little sensitive. So we started this interview. That was an hour-long interview. And after 40 minutes, this wretched man from the IRN, who must be nameless, hadn't put an hour-long tape in. The tape came to an end at the end of 40 minutes. Well, my whole stomach turned over. Dan suddenly realised he had an opportunity to escape. I had to call him, of course, Mr. Vice President, not exactly Dan. But he stood up and said, "Good gracious," he said, "you've got 40 minutes. This is the longest interview I've ever given, in my career. Congratulations sort of thing, now on your bike." And so There was absolute silence. I say my stomach turned over 6 times. And perhaps going back to those early days when I was arrogant and confident enough, to apply to Northern Ireland BBC for a job in the first instance, I thought I must meet like with like here. And I said, Mr. Vice President, I'm here for an Oz programme to go out on our national network on Christmas morning. I said, I need 20 minutes more. I haven't exactly come around the next block to get this interview. Would you kindly sit down and we'll complete it? And he sat down as good as gold. And I was just willing this wretched man from IRN to get the tape off and the other one on, and let us get going.
So that's the way to treat our presidents, is it?
It seemed
like
it worked
like
in this
naughty
case.
children.
And like naughty children. It worked anyway in this case.
You do. I know there's one particular anecdote you're keen to tell about another famed American celebrity.
Yes, well, he was only a vice president, of course.
A mere sapling.
A mere sapling in comparison to Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, as then the Americans insisted you called her. And, of course, she was, as we all know, the First Lady of America before her husband was tragically assassinated in 1963. Anyway, this was one I call the one that got away. I couldn't interview her. She was very sensitive about giving any interviews and so on. But she was working in New York with Doubleday at that time. And a good friend of ours was one of the Frasers from the Fraser family, who were very friendly with the Kennedys family and so on. And Sir Hugh Fraser was on one of my husband's boards. And we were in New York, and so was Sir Hugh, because he had written a book, and he'd gone to consult Jackie at Doubleday about publishing and so forth. And he rang my husband and I at the hotel. We were staying at the Plaza, and he said, how would Geraldine, the girl he liked to call her, how would the girl like to have lunch with Jackie Kennedy Onassis? How would you like to have lunch with Jackie? So she said, oh, of course she would love it. He said, now, of course, one strict stipulation, no recordings, no machinery, no tapes, nothing. That was it. So we were to meet them it had been arranged at the 21 Club, which is frightfully salubrious, on Fifth Avenue in New York at 1 o'clock. So we were there, obviously, at 1 o'clock. There was a queue of people. You couldn't even ring up and make a restaurant in this place unless you were very well known, and so on. Anyway, there was a fierce maitre d' standing on sort of, I remember, red carpet, but a gold tassel blocking the way into the dining room, in restaurant. And so we got to the sort of top of this queue, and we were a bit shy. We sort of said, well, we're here to have, we're guests of Sir Hugh Fraser. Sir Hugh Fraser meant absolutely nothing to this man. He said, sort of back to the back of a queue sort of thing, made no headway there at all. And it was now, we were sort of trying to argue the point. It was now 1:10. We were getting a little panicky. And my husband said, well, as a matter of fact, he should be dining with Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Well, the gold-tasseled cord rope just collapsed to the ground. We were ushered in this very impressive dining room, and there they were at a table right in the middle, of course, where else? And Hugh sat back, really, at that lunch, because he knew her very well, but let us, have a chance and so on. And I thought she was absolutely terrific. She was very well groomed, but very underdressed, no makeup. But she'd done her homework. She knew about the TT races and the Manx cats with no tails. But she could talk on everything. She talked on art, literature, her daughter, her son, everything. Very pleasant. And at the end of the lunch, which she hardly ate anything, I remember there was stuffed tomatoes, which she just more or less manoeuvred around the plate, and drank very little water. However, she did say to me, Geraldine, she said, would you like to see the rest of this 21 Club? And in fact, she said, perhaps you'd like to avail of the amenities here and go to the bathroom. You know how they say that. So I was absolutely dying to go to the bathroom. So we got to the bathroom, and to my horror, there were old-fashioned loos in which there were locks, which you had to sort of undo with a key. And there was a lady attendant in this cloakroom, because obviously it was very upstage. And she recognised Jackie, and Jackie's sister Lee Radziwill had been in the week before, and they got into conversation, and no one was unlocking a loo for me. And to my horror, I realised there was a saucer on a table in which the other ladies and so on were placing dollar bills. And I had no money with me. I had a small purse, but I had no money because, I was with my husband. So I had absolutely nothing, and I couldn't pay to go in, to spend a penny. And suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, Jackie Kennedy Onassis saw one's predicament, and she stopped talking to the attendant, and she said, "Oh," she said, "you are a guest in our country. Allow me." And she placed the dollar bill on the saucer, and immediately the attendant opened up one of these loos.
I'll bet you.
And I want this on my epitaph, Roy, that the former First Lady of America paid for me to go to the bathroom.
What a way to end a conversation. Roy Macmillan interviewing Geraldine Jamieson.
Here's that holiday feeling. Manx Radio, Isle of Man.
What makes Christmas special or memorable is going to be different for every single one of us. But as David Collister often discovered in conversation with country people, strong memories of happy times often come from very simple things. Doris Madrill was born in the early 1900s, the middle child with a younger brother and an older sister, and she lived all her life in Cregneash, a very straightforward life that certainly didn't include going shopping for gifts at Christmas or any other time.
I mean, we only went to Port St Mary for shoes, you know, because your mother made your clothes. You never got a bought unless my mother had a relation, and she would come home from Liverpool and she'd always bring in perhaps a nice dress for my sister and myself. My mother was good to sew. And this Mrs. Tumman, any girls that didn't go into service, and my mother didn't because she was a bit frail, and she taught them how to sew. And then my mother said to me, "You've got to learn to sew too." I never remember her sitting doing nothing or reading. She always had socks on a needle, because my father was a skipper on a schooner and my great uncle was at sea, and they were always needing socks.
What sort of games would you play?
It's what I've told you. My father was a schooner skipper, and a lot of his trade, if it wasn't to Liverpool or Runcorn, it was up to Thurso, and then he would get a cargo there and go right down to Methil, down on the east coast of England, I suppose it was. So I said once to my mother, "How did you manage for Father Christmas?" Of course, I was gone in years, 21 then. Well, she said, when your father was away, he would look round for a spinning top, and of course, if there was one, that had to be two. You see, because my sister, and there'd be two dolls, and then there'd be skipping ropes. And of course, we were so well off because we'd skipping rope with bells on, you see. But you see, I suppose he only went round the markets, and he would buy enough for our...
Father Christmas.
Yes. It was skipping ropes. Then we had wooden tops that had a whip, and we had hoops. Well, that was only to put round when you went down to the well for water. And that hoop was supposed to keep your clothes dry. But if you couldn't find your wooden hoop, you'd take this hoop and there was a crook going with it, you know. My goodness, we could do wonders with them, you know.
Could you?
Oh, yes, and some of the boys could do all sorts of things, you know. And I remember one of the boys, he took one of the wooden hoops and he put it round his waist and he was rigged.
And he started doing the hula hoop, did he?
Yes, that was before we ever heard of it.
Oh, right. Of course, before hula hoops were invented, really.
So
later on, of course, boys used to take the wheels off old bikes and use them, didn't
yes.
they?
Yes, oh yes. And then, of course, the boys up at the letterbox, at the pillar box as we call it, they had a patch and it was polished clean with their caps or their sleeves where they played marbles, and you'd hear them shouting, "Twosies, cracks, no holes over," you know. And we little ones were watching to see, you know, watching these marbles, and there was some of the boys had good glass, beautiful glass marbles. Wherever they got them, I don't know.
Doris Madrill of Cregneash recalling her childhood games and Christmas gifts in conversation with David Collister. I've said many times that we owe a huge debt of gratitude to David Collister for the hours and hours that he spent chatting with people and recording their wonderful stories. But opportunities to hear David's own story are rare, but thankfully came along one Christmas time.
The first 10 years of my life, I lived in a farm cottage. It was a 2 up, 2 down. It housed, I think, 6 people, including me at the time. My maternal grandmother was blind, and she occupied one of the downstairs rooms. She was in bed, but she did have the only radio in the house, which was supplied by Randall's, the battery company. They used to come around week by week, top up your nuclear battery and so on. I could only hear this radio from the other room. I never got close enough to it because I wasn't supposed to, as a kid, go into grandmother's room, you see. And it was a house without electricity. It was a house without running water in the house. In fact, we drew the water from what was called, laughingly, a well, which was nothing much more than a cattle trough at the side of the road. I think the quality of the water might have been suspect. Whether it was all boiled before use, I have no idea. But I would go to bed with a candlestick and a candle to light me up the stairs.
Yes.
We were very, very poor. I mean, when you hung up your stockings, early memories anyway, you got little more than, don't forget, I'd be 4 years old when the war started. You'd get an apple, you'd get an orange, you might get a pair of socks. Some nuts would be very likely. I don't remember that we ever had sweets and chocolates at that time. We always had, at the bottom of this sock or stocking, something was wrapped up in scores and scores of wrappings, and we knew what it was going to be eventually. It was a piece of coal, and my mother's idea was it was for luck. You had a piece of coal for luck. Always, my father used to have paper streamers which were fitted diagonally across the ceiling of the room.
Middle light.
Yeah, that was right. Those are the decorations. We might have had a tree. I don't remember trees, though I remember well the smell of the Christmas trees. But my presents, other than whatever was in this stocking, were made by my father. My father was very, very useful as an artist. He painted. In fact, many of his paintings he did as presents at Christmas and gave them to members of the family. And he used to make our toys. He made farmyards with all the animals. He'd cut them out with fret saw and so on, and he'd paint them, and we had all cattle and sheep and so on. They were absolutely fabulous. Of course, I don't know what ever happened to them. These things get lost eventually, don't they? I did eventually get a tricycle. I remember having a tricycle. I had one of the little pedal cars, and I had a rocking horse at some time as well. I lost something at Christmas about 1946 or 1947. By then, I was a radio fanatic. I used to listen to practically everything that was on the BBC. On this particular Christmas, there was one of my favourite programmes was Itmar, Tommy Hanley and his Mrs. Moptier. And in this particular Radio Times this Christmas, there was a full page or a couple of pages, I think, about Itmar and a whole lot of photographs in it. And I must have this. I've got to put it in my collection. When I went to look for that Radio Times, it was nowhere in the house. I'd be about 10, 11, maybe at the time, or something like that. And I said to my mother, I want the Radio Times. Oh, I don't know where it is. As kids are, I've got to have it. So I went searching everywhere for it. Never found the thing, never got over it, and I suspect she used it to light the fire with. I didn't lose the excitement when we had our own children, of course, as time went by. It became an exciting time again for fathers, you see.
Do you remember them Christmases, Annie, when the shops was lit with oil lamps and gas, and they looked cosy and warm and inviting, and folks would crowd round for a skees at this pass? There was one feller I mind made his window a picture with bun loaves and holly. My. Me mouth waters yet at the thought of them, for they were the best on the island. Oh, aye. And all them turkeys and geese in the butchers, fat as mollags, chickens too, a fine mob, and joints of beef from the prize Christmas cattle, and a pig with an orange in his gob. And the town would be busy till midnight, with people shopping or having a couche, and you'd hear, "All again, Mrs. Kelly," and "Same to you, and blind by no, Mr. Carouche." And you remember the stars in the sky, gal, sparkling like jewels in the keen frosty air, as the choirs made their way singing carols from the market through the streets to the square. Oh, aye, them those was the good old days, Annie, when hosses clip-clopped in dog-cart or brougham, and God's peace filled folks' hearts as they parted, to spend a real old-fashioned Christmas at home.
Not again.
Manx Choir Cleoghery Tui, and before that, Jack Corrin recreated Christmas Eve in the Town through the poetry of Kathleen Farragher. The immensely talented Dot Tilbury has a great story for every occasion, but one of my very favourites is this one, all about the visit of Father Christmas.
I was born and brought up in Crosby. My dad went from the Isle of Man to World War II, and he met my mum, who was from Newcastle, and he brought her back to the Isle of Man, and they had a local government board house, which were built at Crosby, Bromwich Grove, and we were in number 3, but of course I wasn't born then. And then my sister was first, then me, then my brother Peter. And Christmas times were very happy times because we didn't have lots of toys or anything like they've got now, but we never felt deprived or anything. You know, we always sort of felt, we used to get the tangerine with the silver paper on, yes, and the usual things. But Christmas Day, we'd get up and there'd be a gift for us and a pillowcase with bits in. And then in the afternoon, we used to go down to my Auntie Doe's, who lived down in a little bungalow in the village. And she used to say, about an hour after we'd arrived, that she'd forgotten to get the milk. And she'd go out of the house, and we took no notice. We just thought she'd forgotten to get the milk. And about quarter of an hour later, there'd be a knock on the window, and Father Christmas would be at the window. And we go, oh, it's Father Christmas. My Nana Kelly was there, and Uncle Tom, and my cousins, and my Uncle Eddie and Auntie Mary from Douglas, and their boys and girls, and a real scotch. I was only a little bungalow, but we all squeezed in, and Father Christmas came in to give out the presents. And this went on for years, and we just thought, you know, it's just like you'd died and gone to heaven. You know, we didn't know who it was. And then one year I looked and I thought, Auntie Doe, that's a blouse. And she had like a Rupert Bear blouse on. I can still see it. It was yellow with black check. And I thought, Auntie Doe had a blouse on like that. I wonder if Father Christmas is Auntie Doe. And I was getting a bit older, and I think I just sort of sussed it out that it was Auntie Doe that was Father Christmas. But I didn't dare say anything in case I didn't get any presents. So that, you know, great memories.
The late John Kenyock also had a great gift for collecting stories from the country folk he visited. He went to see Nancy Mills after she published a book about her life. This next part of the same conversation isn't really to do with Christmas, but I think you'll enjoy listening to John being taken completely by surprise by Nancy's story of the doctor and the monkey. It all started chatting about the milk produced on the farm being sold via the family-run milk round in Peel.
You had a milk round in Peel, didn't you?
Yes.
And your Uncle Bobby, I think you said,
yes,
went on the milk
yes,
round.
He was very popular in Peel because he used to get on well with all the lady customers.
He was a nice man, though, wasn't he? I remember him.
Yes, he was always full of fun.
He was.
And I remember we used to tell awful tales. There was a Dr. Longson in Peel. By the bus station. He had this thing, and he used to have a pet monkey. And everywhere he went, he took this pet monkey with him in the car. One day, my Uncle Bobby said he went in to give him the milk. He used to walk right in through the door into the back and put the milk into the jug, you know. And as he was going past the coal oven, the door was open and he shut it as he was going past. And apparently the monkey was in the oven. And the doctor's wife said, "What have you done with my monkey?" You know. And this monkey used to come round with him when he came to the farm with medicine, a bottle of medicine. You got a tonic or something. And once he came when I wasn't well, he gave me medicine. But I never got the medicine because the monkey drunk it.
Oh, dear.
I can remember that.
Right. Well,
Isn't that just a wonderfully infectious laugh? John Kenyuk being hugely entertained by Nancy Mills. Our next little bit of nostalgia pays tribute to two people who, through their teaching skills, have enabled countless singers and public speakers to achieve their full potential. And that might not mean taking part in any competitions. To experience the joy of singing or to feel confident when giving a vote of thanks is just as valuable as winning a class in the Manx Music Festival. It would be impossible to work out how many people Mrs. Pat Corrin has assisted to become confident speakers, or how many people Mrs. Eleanor Shimmin has filled with the love of music. Listen now as Mrs. Pat Corrin recites from the works of Manx poet Kathleen Farragher, and that's followed by the Aig Threshlin Children's Choir, founded by Mrs. Eleanor Shimmin and directed by her for over 25 years.
No light inside the little church, save that on crib and laden tree, where shadows hover warm and dark, with air of deep expectancy. Then, through the ancient oaken door, the guides and brownies wend their way on quiet feet. And from each hand a candle sheds its softened ray. How reverently they take their place within God's house, and as they sing, their sweet young voices tell again the story of the babe, the King. They bring before our eyes the star, the shepherds resting in the field above the hills of Bethlehem, where God's great purpose was revealed. They sing the message from their hearts, their youthful faces all aglow with earnestness and joy and love. God grant, wherever they may go, that faith will guide them through the years, unfaltering, steadfast, shining bright, as when they sang and knelt and prayed in Doon's small church by candlelight.
Mother
And I'm afraid this is where I need to put everything back on the Christmas shelf, close the archive room door and return you to the present day. So till whenever we meet again, this is Judith saying thank you for listening and wishing you a happy Boxing Day.
Here's that holiday feeling.